Go ahead and start.
Okay, you can just skip the title page. Okay, so I'm just gonna cover some basic information before we hop into things like current events and stuff like Gordon said. So the basic definition of global trade is the exchange of goods and services between countries. And this allows countries to expand their markets and get access to goods and services that aren't really available or are more expensive to make at home. And this causes the market to become more competitive, which leads to competitive pricing, since you want lower prices to attract buyers. And then finally, that just gives consumers cheaper products in general. So more basics, an import is a product sold to the global market, and an export is a product bought from the global market. And different countries have different natural resources such as land, labor, technology. So obviously that means that each country has products that they're kind of known for and they can produce efficiently. So and that obviously means that they can sell it cheaper than other countries. So in global trade, this is called specialization. So as an example, England, which is the green country, so they have England has a lot of pastures and sheep, so they can cheaply manufacture cloth. And Portugal, which is the orange country, they have a lot of vineyards and they can cheaply make wine. So as a result, England has basically stopped producing wine and Portugal has basically stopped making cloth over time because it costs more for them to make it and they've found it more advantageous to just start trading with each other. So this scenario is an example of comparative advantage, which is the economy's ability to produce a good or service at a lower opportunity cost than its trading partner. So what a opportunity cost is basically what you are losing when you make a decision. So let's say pretend you're England, you're the country of England. You have two choices, and it's the first one is to create just cloth and the second one is to make both cloth and wine. So which choice has a higher opportunity cost? And you can drop that in the chat. You can just put a number like one or two.
Colleen, repeat the numbers, please.
Oh, sorry. So the first choice, if you're England, remember, so England has a lot of pastures and sheep. So the first choice, would you rather make just cloth or would you make both cloth and wine? So which choice are you losing more? Yeah, so it is the second choice that you're losing more. So the opportunity cost of making both cloth and wine is losing to Portugal because it is more expensive to make wine. And there's a far smaller opportunity cost for making just cloth because Portugal would gladly trade their wine for your cloth. Yeah, Matthew, I basically learned this all from econ. So this graphic just shows the difference between comparative and competitive advantage. So competitive advantage is basically a country, business, individual that just has better value. And then a comparative advantage is when a country loses less from producing a good or service that is efficient to make at home. So that is just England making cloth. So there are also many barriers to trade, like natural barriers such as distance or language, or like a mountain range or something. Second, there are tariff barriers such as taxes on important goods that make it more expensive to buy from goods from outside the country. And then non-tariff barriers such as import quotas, embargoes, and regulations. So tariffs and trade barriers are used to first protect domestic employment because importing goods hurts producers in the country and then therefore employment. The second is to protect consumers because there could be products that like are dangerous, like this meat might have a disease, so they would put a tax on it. Third is national security. So some defense industries they need protection. And then fourth is retaliation. So it's basically punishment if a country thinks that their trading partner has broken rules or policies.
Hey, real quick, Colleen, can you explain to us what an import quota is and what an embargo is?
Okay. Honestly, I don't know what an embargo is, but I think like import quota is just like. Wait, let me look up embargoes.
I can say embargo. You can say import quota.
Guys, there's no shame in looking things up. It's an important research skill. When if you guys were ever to get into investment or business, it's a valuable skill to be able to research things that like really quickly.
Yeah. So
And at the same time, if you ever don't know anything, please say I don't know instead of like, trying to BS your way out of it. I mean, that's fine too. But I mean, you save yourself a lot of face if you just say I don't know, like Colleen did, which is good.
yeah, so it's basically regulations of what you're importing from outside the country.
Yeah, embargo is a kind of like a cover it all umbrella term. And then import quota is Colleen.
Huh? Oh, I just said. It's
Well,
like
I guess
restrictions.
I would say that's kind of more. Yeah, I guess a quota is more like a specific number. Like when they always say quotas for like college or whatever your views are on that. A quota is like a specific number that you have to hit, and you can't go over it or under it. Depends. And so when they say import quotas, that usually means you can't import more than this certain amount to protect the domestic industry.
All right, so hi guys, I'm Adi, and today I'll be talking about national economies and their futures. Next slide. All right, so today we'll be covering the following topics. So, what is a national economy? Imports and exports, and the key features of economies, as well as the different types of economies in our world, such as developed versus developing economies, and diversified versus quote unquote dependent economies, and also we'll be covering self-sufficiency. Yeah, next slide. All right, so first let's just talk about what a national economy is. So basically, a national economy encompasses the exchange of all goods, services, and currency within a country. So basically, whatever happens related to business and finance within one country's borders. So this is also this financial trade is regulated by each nation. In addition, it's also regulated by international things such as trade agreements, and even obviously when there's a hostility between two nations, like how they said before, like embargoes and tariffs are also going to regulate this global trade and national economies. And also this also creates a global economy, which is each national economy's relation with the rest of the world's economies. So these economies are defined by capital, labor, and resources. So capital is basically like investment and what money you can put into a business. Labor is basically like the workforce and the work that you can do. And also resources are all like natural resources such as like oil, coal, maybe lumber. All these kind of things are all natural resources. And also these are both imported and exported in and out of the country, which means like bringing things in and taking things out of the country, regulated by supply and demand for the rest of the world. So yeah, next slide. All right, so let's talk about imports and exports. So as I covered before, imports are the things that the country brings in, and exports are the things that the country ships out. So basically, imports are like foreign goods that other countries make, and that will be the other country's exports, which are then brought into let's say our country, and we use them for our own purposes. So also governments will often try to control the imports because maybe they want to export more money so they can actually earn more money for their own country, or they're tired of being in debt to other countries. So what they do is they try to manipulate the amount of imports by tariffs, subsidies, trade agreements, and devaluation. So I'll explain all these in a second, but let me just go back to exports first. So exports are basically the manufactured goods that are sent out of the country, and we calculate the net exports by the exports minus imports. So that's basically saying is the country more of an import country or more of an export country. So if there's a positive number, that means that there's obviously more exports than imports, meaning that that country has a trade surplus, and if not, that means it has a trade deficit. So back to manipulating the imports. So tariffs are essentially extra taxes on foreign goods so that people will want to buy domestic goods. Subsidies are basically what we call benefits, and they will be benefiting domestic manufacturers and companies. And trade agreements we already talked about before. And devaluation is by actually inflation of the currency so that other things become more expensive if you buy them outside the country. So yeah, next slide, please.
Before we jump to that, Audie, can you talk about the graphic a little bit?
Oh yeah, sure. So basically, this graphic here is showing who the which countries the United States imports from the most, and as you can see, its biggest importer is China, and that means because most of the manufacturing that we see in the United States comes from China, and also you can see a lot of like local countries as well as European countries are big trade partners with the United States, and also you can see why people feel that there's some sort of dependency in terms of economically on China, which is part of our politics as well. So yeah.
And so just to be clear, this is like imports from other places into the US, right?
Yes, that's correct.
So obviously we have a lot of imports from China, not unexpected. And I'm sure this group will talk about that more later.
Yeah. All right, next, we're going to talk about developed versus developing countries and economies. So I'm sure you guys already know what that is, but anyways, developed countries are often the more richer countries, and developing countries are the more worse off ones. So as you could expect, developed countries have like a higher life expectancy, literacy, and GDP per capita, which means each person is like wealthier. And also that means that due to this, there's low corruption, and also these kind of economies tend to be more industrialized because they're more advanced, so they can do things like manufacturing, and they won't be doing raw material exports. But on the other hand, developing economies are obviously poorer, and they have more high corruption problems. Yeah. So and also they have often a more low-tech economy because they can't afford such advanced technology. So that means that they usually do more like agriculture or resource extraction type economies. So yeah. All right, so now let's talk about diversification. So this is also a common thing that we see in investing as well, but diversification is in terms of global and national economy is basically when we build revenue from multiple different sources of industry in a country. So that means that it's very good because that means that there's more economic growth in our country, right? Because we can employ people that fits everyone's strengths and skill set, and in addition, we can have more different industries so we can best serve our people. And in addition, it also protects national economy from significant loss during an economic downturn. And also we can see in a trend that industrialized nations tend to be the diversified ones. So let's take a look at the graph below. So on the left, I have an economic graph of the Central African Republic, which is a very poor nation in Africa. And on the right, I have France, which is one of the wealthiest countries in the world in Western Europe. So let's look at the left first. As you can see that the Central African Republic, literally 50%, almost 60% of its economy is based just on the exporting of industrial diamonds, right? So obviously that might be a big source of income for them. But if maybe the diamond market goes down, then they're in trouble because like most of their wealth and source of money comes from that, right? But on the other hand, if we look at France's economy, we can see that only like we have many different sectors, and each one provides a good amount of money towards the economy, which is good. So even if like let's say the travel and tourism goes down, or maybe the manufacturing goes down, or produce goes down, like the economy of France will still be able to keep going strong. Yeah, and I think this is the last slide, but for me at least, and this is what we're going to talk about: self-sufficiency. So self-sufficiency basically means that you're able to take care of yourself. And in terms of a national economy, a self-sufficient economy means that it can provide everything for itself. If you look at the diagram here, see, look, as you can see, it's providing its own livestock, its own military, its own manufacturing, energy, oil, gas, everything. So that means that basically everything that the country has is produced by itself. That means obviously it's probably like very beneficial because I mean, if you're in trouble or something, if you're against a bunch of other countries and they don't give you things, right, you can still manage by yourself, and you don't need to be dependent on anybody else. And that means that other countries don't have leverage over you, right? So obviously it's it would be very nice if you could do this, but obviously it's not that reasonable because it's very rare for a country to have all types of resources so that it can completely be like it can preserve itself like this. And also it's also more stable in the event of like a loss of a trading partner or tariffs and embargoes. So yeah, that's all.
So now we're going to be jumping into economic diplomacy in the United States, but we're also going to be covering different types of international organizations that span across many different countries. So what is economic diplomacy? Essentially, it's the foreign relations between states that combines tools of economic analysis with diplomatic skills in order to develop a country economically and politically. So it involves four main different parts that we're going to talk about today. Number one is increasing support. So they're trying to increase support. When a country enters economic diplomacy, they're trying to increase support for the growth of national businesses. So all of the corporations and companies within that nation. And then they're trying to do this by expanding into international trade. So essentially that allows for the businesses in a country like the United States to export either product or service outside to other countries and then bolster the American economy while expanding the growth of that company. Number two is the usage of economic sanctions. So economic sanctions are most of the time in diplomacy, they're going to be used to punish terrorist financiers, so people that fund terrorism, and also smugglers, so people that attempt to get goods into a country by illegal means, or if it's not part of the country's quota. So maybe they're trying to add more goods or too little goods, trying to take away from a country. Number three, building foreign policy. So foreign policy is the relation between a country, and in economic diplomacy, that's essentially a country wants to maintain strong relationships across foreign affairs. So like a couple, for example, again, the United States and maybe China, there's a lot of exports and imports going in between those two countries. So just maintain those strong relationships to help bolster trade. And number four, we're going to talk about using economic tools. So economic tools are the tools that a country uses, and they can involve empirical analysis. So like we always talk about using different types of technical and fundamental analysis, looking at data, statistics, but they use these economic tools to bolster imports, exports. So they want to increase the exports that other countries get from a country. They want to improve international investments. And of course, they also want to get into international lending. So when a country lends to another, of course, the lender country can make a profit off of that too. So those are the four main points of economic diplomacy. So our first slide is going to be on the economic diplomacy and trade diplomacy of the United States. So we're going to start with two main organizations, which are going to be the ITA, the International Trade Administration, and the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative. So the ITA, what are they? So they fall under the United States Department of Commerce, and essentially what they do is they're trying to strengthen the US's competitiveness in industry. So they want to really increase the industry of the United States by increasing our company's outreach into many different other international markets. They also want to promote trade and investment, ensuring fair trade, making sure that US consumers and business owners aren't being taken advantage of in the global market, and they want to regulate compliance with trade laws and agreements. So we're going to talk about some of those trade laws later in our current events section, and also with the WTO, which we're going to get to. So the ITA is comprised of three main units. The three units are going to be I&A, so industry and analysis. Number two is going to be global markets, GM, and the last one is going to be E&C, which is enforcement and compliance. So we're going to break down what each of these do. We're going to start with the I&A. The I&A unit monitors change in trade imports and exports. They essentially gather statistical data, and they help strategize how the United States is going to invest into foreign markets, what countries they're going to expand in, how much extent that country is going to get of American influence, and the extent of American business in foreign markets. Number two is global markets. Now, INA pretty much gathers all the statistical economic data that surrounds us expanding, but the global markets sector of the ITA, essentially they promote the United States' exports through small and medium-sized enterprises. So this means that maybe there's a company that's not as large scale as like a Walmart or an Amazon or a big giant, but they want to help advance maybe a smaller local business into outside trade. And then finally, we have enforcement and compliance, ENC, and what they do is they there's many different things that they do, but the most important thing that they do is they need to regulate dumping. So the word dumping is essentially when a country exports a product at a price that is lower in the than the foreign importing market. So essentially, there's a country that is importing to another country, but their imports are a lot cheaper than the same product at the country that's getting the imports. So like an example of this and why this would be bad would be if, for example, a lot of goods are cheaper in China. If those Chinese goods came to the United States and they flooded our market, maybe there's a really cheap, really affordable smartphone that they have, and they import that into the United States, and that severely undercuts the prices of US smartphones. Which would really damage American business and really damage our economy because it supports the Chinese economy while simultaneously taking away from ours. And so that's why dumping is just a real issue between countries. And then secondly, we have to make sure that those foreign trade barriers are protected and that no country is violating the American civil trade. So this question is just out of curiosity. If you guys were to choose between working in industry and analysis, global markets, and enforcement and compliance, which one would you guys work with? You guys can just throw it in the chat, that's fine. If you guys need a reminder, INA is they gather the data, statistical data, and strategic plans. Global markets, they help promote small businesses, and enforcement enforces against dumping and other policies. You guys can just throw it in the chat if you want. Okay, so we're seeing a lot of global markets. I guess most people are more interested in the execution rather than the gathering of data, or rather than enforcing any laws. Okay, so that's the ITA. We pretty much covered that. Our next organization is going to be the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative. So the Trade Representative is essentially the number one person for negotiations in the United States and between other countries. So they're responsible for U.S. international trade, commodity, direct investment policy, everything you see right there. And they're kind of like the official trade negotiator of the United States. So that would make them like anytime the United States gets into a trade agreement with another country, they would send in the U.S. Trade Representative who heads that department, the office, and they would have them essentially negotiate the best price or the best import-export rates with the other country's representative. And this is a cabinet level executive. Our current one is, I believe it's Catherine Tai, who is, I could be wrong, I think she's a Chinese American, so woman of minority in office, and she was appointed under President Joe Biden in starting 2021, and she is our current head of the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative. So she is the trade representative of the United States. And essentially the USTR representative, they get to choose different issue areas to work under. And these issue areas can range from again, economy, they can range to intellectual property, even going into labor, government, small businesses, any type of different industry they can choose to work with, and they can choose to help execute deals with other countries. So this person is really important because they pretty much are the person in charge of every type of negotiation we get into internationally. Okay, so I know we just spent a lot of time talking with the U.S. Trade Representative and the U.S. organizations, but now we're going to get into the WTO, the World Trade Organization. So I know you guys if anyone has ever taken if anyone's ever taken AP Human Geography, you guys will get into these type of international organizations. And I think WTO is probably one of, if not the most important one. And essentially what this organization does is it's an international organization for trade agreements. There are currently 164 current members, and the entire membership has to make decisions. So no individual country within the WTO will make any type of decision without the backing of the other members. So 164 members in total. So we're going to go through all of their top 5 things that the WTO is responsible for. Number 1, they have to facilitate trade negotiations. So essentially, this is negotiations covering any type of good, services, even intellectual property. And this is pretty much just to promote the open market economy of globalization and of making sure that all member countries in the WTO keep their borders open and have fair agreements. Number 2, they need to make sure there's a lot of implementation and monitoring. So this requires national governments to abide by trade laws and maintain transparency, make sure that no other country is getting taken advantage of. And an example of these laws being broken is during the US-China trade war, which I think Keshav's going to get into a little bit later. We're going to get into that, but the summary is the American government under the Trump administration broke some of the rules of the WTO, and they so there's a policy in world trade called trade discrimination, where you're not allowed to target a single country and charge them more in tariffs than any other country. And so under the Trump administration, the US targeted China and had trade discrimination when they raised all tariffs from Chinese imports. And this covered around almost half a trillion dollars worth of goods. And it was way over the maximum rates agreed to by the US. So part of the WTO's responsibilities is the dispute settlement aspect, in which they have to make sure that there's really smooth trade flows from country to country, and there's no disputes regarding to trade. And during the trade war, this was essentially ignored because the WTO by itself doesn't have much power. They can only really advise countries to take their word on anything. But Trump, who is heavily opposed against the WTO, really wanted to, actually for a while, he actually wanted to take us out of the WTO, but that obviously didn't end up happening. And he chose to ignore the trade regulations that he agreed to and that the United States had previously agreed to. And he chose to overcharge Chinese goods. And that started the trade war when China chose to launch more tariffs against American goods. And okay, so our next thing is going to be building trade capacity, which is essentially the WTO is trying to help out developing countries, which we talked about before, and provide trade capabilities for those less developed countries. And then lastly, we have outreach, which is outreach to like non-government organizations, other international organizations, to the media. Just make sure that everyone like knows what's going on in the public.
So now I'm going to be talking about the effect of trade on diplomacy. Before I start, can anyone think about what mechanisms like would allow trade to play a role in economic diplomacy? If you can, just type it in the chat. Okay, for now, next slide, please.
Rithul, why don't you repeat the question, or you can reword it, because I'm not sure if it's exactly clear what you want us to do.
Okay, so in what way can trade affect? What way can like countries use trade to affect their economic diplomacy?
I think if you guys have listened to the past like 30 minutes, hopefully you guys have some ideas. I think they've talked about a couple of them. So you guys can just like throw out any keywords in the chat if possible.
Yeah, sanctions, that's a good one.
I think Colleen talked about a couple of these that we were going through. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, those are all valid answers. Next slide, please. So as Gordon said, economic diplomacy is one of the major factors of international diplomacy as a whole. The three elements used in economic diplomacy are commercial diplomacy, bilateral investment, as well as certain international organizations like the World Trade Organizations, the World Trade Organization. Most of these are heavily impacted by trade. Commercial diplomacy is like a smaller subset of diplomacy that focuses on helping businesses grow over multiple countries. The United States uses this type of diplomacy a lot. Their International Trade Administration has like resources towards this. Bilateral trade and investment is pretty much what it sounds like. It's basically types of investment between countries. And yeah, so it's clear that trade will have a huge impact on diplomacy through these three mechanisms. Next slide, please. So an example of trade having an impact on diplomacy is China's Belt and Road Initiative. It is basically an infrastructure development strategy that resembles that of the old Silk Road that you might have actually learned about in world history. It's basically building a large trade network through the east. And as you can see, most the routes are on the diagram on the right, and they all lead towards China because China is the one heading this project. Its goal in creating this trade route is to stimulate trade through Asia and Europe and allow for more economic growth. But this trade route also has a diplomatic effect. It allows many developing countries to grow their economies. And this basically lets China invest in the development of other countries and have an influence on their future growth. Next slide, please. The United States also uses trade as a part of their diplomacy. It's most prevalent since Secretary of State Clinton a few years back declared that she would put economic statecraft at the heart of America's foreign policy agenda. So what economic statecraft is basically the process by which a country can use strategies such as trade to control foreign policy, governing, and diplomacy as a whole. Many of the answers in the chat for the questions a few slides back are pretty much just types of economic statecraft. Economic statecraft is pretty different from other standard tools used, such as military statecraft. It can also be either negative or positive. A negative example would be trade embargoes, and a positive example would be foreign investment. On the right, you can see a map of trade embargoes, which is a negative type of economic statecraft, where the red countries are ones that have been embargoed. And this is yet another way that trade is used in government, and that is how global trade and diplomacy are like closely tied together and can affect one another. Next slide, please.
A quick word before we move on. I actually was under the impression that economic sanctions and these stuff like this are actually soft power. But if you guys are interested, it's actually hard power. Like Rithul was talking about military power, which is obviously hard power. But hard power and soft power are like basically the two branches that countries kind of use to influence each other or to fight for power. So soft power would be things like Hollywood, K-dramas, K-pop, stuff like that. And hard power would be things like military and econ.
Okay, yeah, current events. So there's a few actually right now, and some pertain to a positive relationship and some are negative. Like, for example, the U.S.-China trade war on the next slide. So yeah, a major current event right now is the U.S.-China trade war, which is an example of a lack of bilateral trade from both sides and a compromisation of economical diplomacy and heavy discouraging of global trade. And the reason for this is that both sides have implemented trade tariffs and barriers since 2018, like through the years on both sides. So if you recall, earlier slides talked about how bilateral trade is necessary for economic diplomacy, which goes to show the state that the US-China diplomacy is currently in because they're just in an unprecedented trade war. And if you recall Gordon's slide, he mentioned how the ITA and WTO are in charge of regulating compliance in trade agreements, and more specifically, regulating targeted aggression. So this conflict specifically was technically initiated by the US in 2018 when the Trump administration stepped past the authority of the ITA and WTO by aggressing towards China, applying a 25% tariff issued towards 34 billion US dollars worth of Chinese imports in order to weaken China's military and create more jobs within the US. They also did it to eliminate Chinese manufacturers and limit the access of Chinese companies to US tech because the Trump administration feared espionage and intellectual property theft. So this is shown in the diagram on the right where the conflict since 2018 exponentially escalated since the initial tariff placed by the US. China responded as well, and the US increased the tariff in September and also May. So it's just been growing and growing, and the conflict is still considered to be ongoing.
Okay, a word about this before we move on. I think the U.S.-China trade war is really interesting. And so, like Matt sent to in the chat just now, I wrote the first one, I think. Someone else wrote the second one, but it's like obviously a conflict that's gone on for a while, and I don't think we'll have time for it this year. But last year we made a presentation on the U.S.-China trade war, and we'll send it out at the recap meeting email so that you guys can like look over the presentation if you guys want to. But another like key word about the U.S.-China trade war before we move on is like the import deficit that I think somebody else in this group was talking about. Basically, the fact that China is importing so much to the U.S. as compared to what we're exporting to China.
Yeah, so that being said, Europe is also dealing with an issue pertaining to international diplomacy, and that's Brexit, which is basically the UK being the first nation to recede from the European Union. So over the years, there are actually many signs that the UK was not particularly fond of its integration with the European Union. So for instance, there were surveys conducted in the UK that showed that fewer British residents considered themselves Europeans compared to any other member of the European Union. So even during World War II, Britain was one of the only European states that wasn't occupied, which allowed its empire to remain intact and allowed it to retain its status as a global power, which separated it from the Union state. So as for how Brexit affected economic diplomacy and trade, there was a EU-UK trade and cooperation agreement signed between the UK Parliament and the EU Union Parliament, and basically it sanctioned free trade between the two nations, and which is an example of a relationship that has its economic diplomacy sanctioned through bilateral trade system, which it allowed them to trade freely, and that allowed a positive economic diplomacy. So another case is even more recent, and that's with Biden picking up where Trump left off in building the US's relationship with India. So unlikely as it may seem, due to shared concerns over China and a willingness to cooperate, President Donald Trump began working on diplomatic relationships with Prime Minister Narendra Modi during the middle of his term as president. And although the two states' relationship has been rocky at times, such as even more recently during the COVID-19 pandemic, when Trump threatened India to lift a trade embargo, which was regarding like the vaccine. They were trying to they wanted to lift the embargo because they needed access to certain substances that India was blocking. And their cooperations led to an overall increase, however, in global trade between the two. And also cooperation on global security, which meant basically they could cooperate to an extent regarding foreign affairs, and further discussion regarding China as well. So, which was the main reason that the leaders began cooperating in the first place. Furthermore, India was thrilled by Joe Biden's victory in the US presidential election, since they hoped he could cement the gains of the past few years and make way for a closer US-India partnership. And basically, these discussions resulted in an instance of positive international diplomacy between overseas powers, and also an improvement of the global trade and investment aspect of diplomacy between two states.
All right, so now I'm going to be going over some issues that affect global trade. Next slide. All right, so one of the main ones is that shipments can be confiscated by the government. And so some vocabulary for this is a sanction, and that's basically when a nation restricts another. And so it'll like yield to their in a certain agreement. And so this has been occurring with like US and Iran. And basically the US has been placing sanctions on Iran to like weaken their oil sales and other aspects of their economy, but mainly oil sales because that's like the major part of their economy. And in response, Iran has been like seizing oil tankers to basically retaliate and rebel against these sanctions. And so the US has also been looking to other countries to help them in this like issue, but most countries don't want to get involved because it could lead to war, and they don't want, and they know that it could be centered on like nuclear weaponry, and they don't want to get involved in that. And yeah, next slide. All right, and another issue that I think we also went over before a little bit is counterfeiting and theft of intellectual property. And so intellectual property is basically like property of a person due to the like creativity, so something they produced. And so this can be an issue with companies and on a global level. And so if companies steal or obtain like information or intellectual property of a different company, they could, first of all, it's illegal, and it'll have other problems. It'll lead to other problems, such as companies won't want to work as hard because they know like another company has their ideas, and those other companies that have stolen the information can make new products that could be cheaper, and like people want to buy those instead of the actual thing, even though that company didn't actually work hard to come up with the idea or the product. And this could have consequences on a national level, such as with US and China, because the US accused China of stealing intellectual property. And so that is one of the reasons why US placed increased tariffs on China, which is the next point. So next slide, please. All right, so yeah, the US has increased tariffs, which is basically a tax on an import. And so of course, China is not happy about these tariffs, and they also increased tariffs on the U.S. And so basically, this led to the trade war that Keshav was talking about. And it's basically just a never-ending war because both sides just keep increasing the tariffs, and they're not really getting anywhere, but are just losing more money. And so it basically impacts both of them negatively and also other countries because like since the US and China are so have such big economies, it impacts like the rest of the world as well. And so yeah, it's just trade doesn't go as smoothly for anyone. So that's all I have for global issues.
So my topic is international trade and the environment. And yeah, next slide, please. So international trade requires countries to provide like certain goods and services based off like the environment they live in and their ability to produce products. And countries need to depend on other countries in this process because they can't provide all the goods for themselves. They have to rely on others, and they also have to share the goods they produce with other countries. And if like one or more countries don't provide goods and services, all the countries involved suffer because they don't have access to them. And then international trade is generally in more developed countries and regions like the USA and Europe and some parts of Asia. Next slide, please. So international trade is usually compared to self-sufficiency, but unlike self-sufficiency, international trade involves like multiple other countries and a reliance on those countries instead of just providing for one's own country and like providing everything needed. It's usually considered better because it's easier to get all the things necessary instead of like relying only on your own country, even if you can't produce goods that easily. And it's generally more successful for that same reason. And an example of a country that was once self-sufficient was India, and then they later on they changed to international trade, and their economy benefited as a result. And this graph, it like shows how the GDP changed like percentage wise every year, and it started increasing like more in like the 1990s, which is like around the time when they switched to international trade. And next slide, please. And then the environment can affect goods, products produced, and because only certain products can be produced in certain areas of the world. And this again causes a reliance on certain countries to provide the goods that they can produce easier. And in international trade, these goods can be produced faster and then shared so everyone still gets everything they need, but it doesn't take as much time or like resources to produce. And this occurs the environment limitations is why international trade is favored more than self-sufficiency because self-sufficiency is not as capable of producing all the goods as needed because of the environmental limitations. And this image is like of some of the main climate zones and where they're located in the world. Okay, and then that's all for me.